Hey scholars, Mr. Shaw here again, and today we're going to be talking about a really important thing to know how to draw and paint and sometimes even sculpt in art. And it's something that appears in works of art throughout history. And if we look up here, what does it look like the main idea of this painting is? What is the thing that the artist, whose name is Vincent van Gogh, seems to be focused on? When I look at that, the first thing that pops into my head, the first thing that catches my eye are those beautiful trees, those craggly, branchy olive trees that Vincent van Gogh painted just outside of the town where he lived. Now, one of the things that's really important about painting and drawing trees is making sure that they look like real trees. A lot of times when scholars or sometimes even grown-ups draw trees, sometimes they do it like this. They draw two sticks and then a big old fluffy lump of leaves on top, and it looks kind of like a lollipop. And I call those lollipop trees. And they're not the worst kind of trees in the world. If you're going to draw a picture of trees, at least that's something recognizable. But we can be a little bit more scientific about this. We can be a little bit better at observing our world and observing trees before we draw them, because trees can be a really important part of the setting of your story in your pictures. We talked a lot last week about how settings can change the story, and putting different things in your setting can definitely tell where that story is or when that story is happening. To better display this, to better show an example of this, let's take a look at these two paintings. Oh, I seem to be in the middle of this one. Let me just bump myself over real quick. Ooh, there we go. Now I have a picture, two pictures actually, painted by the same artist, and his name is Peter Bruegel. Now, if you were in first grade, you learned about Peter Bruegel last year, and one of the things that we concentrated on was how he showed different seasons in his picture. Now, in these pictures, I can still see a heavy focus on trees. I see those winter trees that don't have any leaves. They're tall, they're black, they have little pieces of snow along the edges of the branches. And then I see a more summertime tree with people sleeping underneath it. It looks like they're having a picnic. But that tree, even though it still has that same trunk and the same branches, the same general shape, it also is full of green leaves all the way at the top of the tree. And that's one thing that's really important for us to know while we're drawing and painting trees is what we put on the trees, the kinds of leaves we put on the branches, not only tells what kind of tree it is, but can also tell us what season it is. Now, when we're learning about this, there are lots of different ways to make trees, and people have been making trees for centuries. Take a look at this beautiful watercolor painting by a Japanese artist that was made hundreds of years ago. And those trees are very thin and very delicate. And they're actually a type of tree called a cherry tree. And those cherry blossoms, those little pink flowers that grow on them, only grow in the spring. So when I see a tree with those little blossoms, those little flowers growing all over it, that tells me that the setting, the time when it's happening, might be in the spring. Now, sometimes when artists represent trees, it doesn't look much like a tree at all. Take a look at this painting by Piet Mondrian, that blue and black painting. Now, it doesn't look exactly like a real tree, but because Piet Mondrian knew the parts of the tree, he knew to include kind of a thicker trunk down here, that thick part of the tree that goes into the ground, and then he used these curving shapes going all throughout the rest of the picture to make us think of branches, even though they don't look like real branches. If we can draw those parts of the tree, even if you're not very good at drawing, or even if it doesn't look exactly like a real tree, people will look at it and know what you're trying to say. And that's part of what art is about, is communicating an idea. And sometimes it doesn't have to be perfect. As long as people understand what you're drawing and understand what you're trying to tell them, that's really the most important part. Now, before we draw trees, let's have a little science lesson. Take a look at this tree here. Now, this tree has been labeled with the main parts of a tree. Now, if you asked a high school science student what all the different parts of the tree were, there are actually a lot of really, really complicated names for all the little tiny parts that could make up a tree. But we're going to concentrate on these big parts first. Now, the most important part of any tree, actually of any plant, is called the roots. Everybody say that word? Ooh, don't scream it. I want everyone to whisper it this time. Say the roots. Yeah, I hope everyone did that. Now, the roots are the part of the tree or the part of a plant that goes underground and it helps soak up those nutrients. It's kind of the tree's way of getting food from the ground. Now, after the roots growing up from the ground, we have that tall, usually a pretty skinny part of the tree. It's hard and it's straight. Sometimes it bends a little bit, but that part of the tree is called the trunk. Everybody say that word, the trunk. Good. Now, growing out from the trunk as the tree grows up, we have these pieces of wood, because that's what a tree is made primarily of, and they grow out from the trunk and they move in all of these different directions and they split and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as they grow out away from the trunk. And we call that part of the tree the branches. Everybody say that word, the branches. Good job. Now, growing from those branches are typically leaves. Now, some trees have needles instead of leaves, like a pine tree or a conifer tree, but most trees have some sort of leaves growing from those branches. And like I mentioned before, in the spring, sometimes those branches grow buds, which are baby leaves, or blossom into tiny flowers. And then some trees, those flowers actually turn into fruit, like apple trees and banana trees and orange trees and lime and lemon trees. They all grow in pretty much the same way, but a lot of those trees have different shapes and different sizes, but every tree has those main parts. It always, always has roots. A tree always has some sort of trunk, and a tree always has branches. Now, that top part of the tree, and we can see it labeled here with that word crown, that's what we call this entire top area of the tree, where the branches and the twigs and the leaves all grow out and fan out into those big, lovely tree shapes. But when we're drawing our trees, we don't necessarily have to draw them exactly the same way. Take a look at all of these different types of trees. Now, some trees have leaves that change color in the fall and then eventually fall off, like this tree here. And those trees are called deciduous trees. Now, that's not a word that you have to know in kindergarten or first grade. You'll learn about that in maybe middle school or high school. And then we have trees that don't lose their leaves at all. Those are trees that keep those leaves. And those leaves tend to be a little bit skinnier, maybe like pine needles on a pine tree. And those trees are called coniferous trees. And those are trees that stay green all year long, which is why some of them are called evergreen trees. Now, when we're thinking about trees and when we're drawing them today, we can draw them in all sorts of different shapes. Some of them look like the trees that we see here in our neighborhoods, maybe like a maple tree or a spruce tree. Maybe you've been to a very warm location. Maybe you've been to the beach or an island, or maybe down south, and you've seen trees like palm trees that grow pretty much straight up and down, and the branches are very, very small up here, but they still have those leaves growing from those branches. Some trees have a very, very long trunk, like a pine tree or a sequoia tree, and some trees have shorter trunks, like a sakura tree. Some trees have very wiggly, bumpy trunks and branches that go in all different directions, and other trees kind of go straight up and down, like a poplar tree. So when you're drawing your trees today, you can draw any kind of tree you want. And to help you find a place to put those trees, I gave you a little bit of a background on the sheet that you'll be using today. Now, do you think that the background, the setting that I drew on your paper for you is inside of a restaurant? No, that would be silly. Trees can't grow inside of a restaurant, not up out of the floor. Do you think that I'm going to have you draw those trees underwater? No, probably not. There are plants that grow underwater, but trees tend to grow on the land. So I made a nice paper for you that looks like this. And it just has some hills, some ground, maybe some grass, or if you want to make some winter trees, maybe that's all snow. Now, the first thing we want to do when drawing a tree is, should I draw the roots? No, the roots are the part of the tree that's underground. And typically, you don't see the roots of a tree. So I don't have to worry about drawing those. But I do want to draw the part of the tree that comes up out of the ground, and that's the trunk. So if I was drawing a tree in my picture here, the first thing I'd want to do is draw two fairly straight lines coming up from the ground to make that trunk. Now, if my trunk has kind of that bumpy bark on the outside, that's kind of like the skin of the tree, that hard, rough wood on the outside, I could draw some wiggly lines up the trunk of that tree just to make it look a little bit more like real wood. If I wanted to, I like to draw these little triangle shapes down at the bottom of my trees to give people the impression, to make them think about those roots that are growing out from the tree and into the ground to soak up those nutrients and to soak up the water. Then I'm going to draw some branches. Now, we want to resist the urge to just do a big lollipop of leaves up at the top. Like, that's not a very realistic looking tree, and it doesn't grow the way that trees typically grow. So I'm going to just get rid of that there. Instead, I actually want to draw first the way a tree would look in the winter. So I'm going to draw all of those branches, all of those pieces of wood kind of stretching out like fingers coming out from the tree. And I can do all these little twigs and the branches coming out in all these different directions. And then once I've done that, well, now I know where those leaves are going to grow. Now I know where those big bunches of leaves and shapes can come out from my tree. So instead of just doing one big lollipop shape, I would imagine that this branch would have a little fluffy section of leaves, and those leaves are just growing right off those little branches. And then I could have another one up here. Ooh, I'm going to stop at the edge of my picture there. I could have it go up into my name, but I don't want to cover up my name. Oh my gosh. I totally forgot to write my name on my paper. Now, if you're working and you realize halfway through class you forgot to write your name, that's okay. You do want to make sure, and sometimes even I forget, to write your name on your paper so that you don't lose it. Now, at the end of class, you are going to get to keep these. You can take them home today. You can put them right in your take-home folder, but it's always a good idea to put your name on your paper so it doesn't get lost. So I'm still working on my tree up here, and I'm just going to give this last section of branches just some leaves up here, and I like to draw those little bumps to make it look really leafy and fluffy up there. Now, if I wanted to, maybe this is a fruit tree. Maybe there's apples growing in that tree. And later on, I could take out my crayons and color those red, but for now, I'll just make them black. Maybe it's a plum tree. I really like those black plums that you can get at the grocery store. And I think I'm gonna have one more branch peeking out here with just a little bit of leaves. Now, that's one kind of tree, but I can draw any kind of tree I want. And at the end, when I'm done drawing my picture, I'm actually gonna play a slideshow of a bunch of different kinds of trees to give you some ideas about all the different shapes they can be. But one of my favorite kind of trees to draw are those coniferous trees, those pine trees, those evergreen trees that never ever lose their leaves. Now, if I was drawing that, I would do the same thing I did for this plum tree that I drew on the left. I'm going to draw a straight trunk coming up like this. It's going to be a little skinnier because it's a little further away. I'm going to draw those lines for the roots. Then I'm going to have it come up to a point. Now, pine trees or coniferous trees, they don't grow their branches going all out in different directions. They kind of grow in straight lines, and they start at the top in very small lines, and then the branches get longer and longer and longer as they go down, because the branches down at the bottom of the tree have actually been there longer. They're older, so they grow wider. And the branches that are growing way up here at the tippy top tend to be smaller. So those branches would be much, much smaller because they're newer branches. And further down on the tree, where those branches might be older, and they're growing pretty straight on this kind of tree, they get wider and wider and wider. Now, if I wanted to draw this whole thing with a pencil, I absolutely could. But if you're working on your picture and you want to add some color to it, now would be a good time. Sometimes I like to draw the trunk of the tree and the branches of the tree, and then I might switch to a green crayon. And instead of drawing those big fluffy leaves like my plum tree has, I know that pine trees have needles. So I'm actually just going to color those green needles kind of coming off those branches like this. Now, those needles aren't like the needle you would get if you went to the doctor and got a shot, but they are kind of pointy and they are shaped very similarly. And I'm just going to use little lines to kind of make those needles. And as you see, you might recognize this as looking more like a real pine tree or an evergreen tree that maybe you've seen outside in your neighborhood, or maybe you've already gone and picked up a tree to bring inside of your house and decorate. It might be shaped kind of like this. Now, sometimes when I see scholars drawing these types of trees, sometimes they just draw a bunch of triangles, kind of like this, on top of each other. And that's okay. That's one way to do it. But remember, underneath all of that, underneath those triangular shapes, is the real shape of the tree. There is a trunk inside of there, and there are branches, and that's what those triangle shaped leaves, or I'm sorry, those needles are growing out from. So this is one way to do it. It's absolutely fine to draw it that way, but if you want your tree to look really, really real, if you want it to look more like a natural tree, try to draw that inside part first. Draw the trunk, draw those branches. Then you can add the leaves. You can draw that fruit. They could be black plums or red apples, or maybe you'd like to make a tree that's a completely different shape or a completely different size. Some trees are like baby trees. Maybe they were just planted. And some trees, like a sequoia tree or a redwood tree, can grow hundreds of feet into the air. So you could have some really, really big trees in your picture. So once your teacher passes these out and says you can begin, you can draw as many trees as you want in your picture. If you want to, you could even add some additional details. Maybe you'd like to put some grass on the ground, or maybe there are some flowers growing down there because it's the springtime. Maybe the ground is completely covered with snow. Maybe it's nighttime and you draw the moon and some stars, or maybe it's daytime and the sun is shining. Or maybe you'd like to make it rain in your picture because trees need water to grow as well. So I hope you guys had a fun time with this. I hope you learned a lot about trees, and I can't wait to see all of those beautiful, beautiful drawings that you're going to make in class. Some of your teachers have been taking pictures of your drawings and sending them to me, and I'm really enjoying the work that you're doing while I'm gone. I'll be back soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, wash your hands, and I'll see you next time.